The desert held a special kind of silence, one that Isadora Vance had purchased, parcel by parcel, with her fortune. At 30 years old, she was the undisputed monarch of Prosperity Bluff, a town that owed its breath to the silver lode deep beneath the sun-baked earth. Her kingdom was a sprawling manor of red sandstone and dark, polished oak, a defiant island of structure perched on a high bluff. From her study window, she could see the entire town, the neat grid of streets, the hulking silhouette of the Vance silver mine, and the distant, shimmering haze of the desert that stretched to the horizon. She owned it all, the mine, the bank, the land, the very dust under their feet. It was a gilded cage of her own meticulous construction. The townsfolk moved through the streets, below like ants in a farm she had built. Their respect was a tangible thing, laced with a fear she had carefully cultivated. She was not a cruel queen, but she was an exacting one. Contracts were law, debts were paid on time, and loyalty was rewarded in cold, hard cash. Disloyalty was met with financial ruin. She had learned young, after her father's sudden death left her with a claim and a mountain of debt. That sentiment was a currency that held no value here. She had hardened her heart to survive, and in doing so, she had built an empire. But lately, the walls of her cage felt thin. A splinter group of 4 cowboys had taken up residence at the Lonesome Star Saloon, and they did not abide by the unwritten rules of her domain. They were led by a man named Jedediah Crowe, a figure who seemed carved from the same sun-bleached wood and stubborn stone as the desert itself. His eyes were the color of a winter storm, pale and chilling, and they held a stillness that was more threatening than any bluster. He and his men, a hulking brute named Hodge, a wiry, nervous man called Finch, and a silent, deadly shot known only as Preacher, did not drink to forget. They drank to remember, their gazes constantly scanning, their hands never straying far from the worn handles of their Colts. Izzy felt their presence like a sickness in the air. They weren't here for work. They weren't here to spend their pay. They were here for her. The knowledge was a cold stone in her gut, a constant, gnawing fear that her wealth, the very thing she had believed was her ultimate protection, had instead painted a target on her back. It was a different kind of debt, one that could not be settled with banknotes or silver ingots. Her head foreman, a weathered Pima man named Mateo, confirmed her fears one evening as he stood hat in hand in her study. "They ask questions, Signora Vance," he said, his voice low and grave. "Not about the mine or work. They ask about you, your habits, your rides. Who guards you? What do they want?" Izzy asked, her voice calm despite the frantic beating of her heart. She poured a glass of amber whiskey, her hand steady. Appearances were everything. Mateo's dark eyes met hers. "I think they believe the mine is a prize, that a woman should not hold such a thing. They talk of reclaiming it for the rightful hands." Rightful hands. The words echoed in the opulent room. Her hands, which had fought and schemed and built this town from nothing, were deemed unworthy because they were a woman's. The injustice of it was a fresh kind of fury. That night, she walked the length of her balcony, the dry wind tugging at the sleeves of her dressing gown. The desert below was a sea of black, punctuated by the faint, lonely lights of the town. She was the richest woman in the territory, perhaps in the whole Arizona territory, and yet she had never felt more exposed. Her guards, loyal as they were no match for the kind of ruthless determination she saw in Jedediah Crowe's eyes. He was a man with a cause, and she was the obstacle. And in her experience, men with causes were the most dangerous of all. She looked out toward the dark, jagged teeth of the Dragoon Mountains, a place her foreman called Chiricahua Land, a place she never ventured. A memory, faint as a desert mirage, flickered in her mind. A wounded man. A shared look. A choice made from a place of compassion she thought she had buried long ago. It felt like a lifetime ago, a story belonging to another woman. She pushed the thought away. That was a ghost. Jedediah Crowe and his men were a very real and very present storm gathering at her gate. The gilded bars of her cage were about to be tested. The memory came to her unbidden, a ghost stirred by the pervasive scent of dust and fear. It was not a fond memory, but a sharp, visceral one, etched into her mind with the clarity of a canyon petroglyph. 7 years ago. She was 23, her father newly buried, the weight of his ambitions and his debts crushing her slender shoulders. The claim to the silver-rich mountain was hers, but her hold on it was as fragile as a desert bloom. The men, the investors, the foremen, their eyes were full of doubt and a hungry, calculating condescension. Desperate to prove herself, to feel the solid rock of her own destiny, she had taken to riding out alone into the vastness that bordered her inheritance. On that day, she had ventured farther than usual into the broken, red rock country where the maps turned vague and the authority of Prosperity Bluff dissolved into ancient, unclaimed silence. It was there she found him. At first, she thought it was a bundle of discarded rags, but her mare had shied, snorting in alarm. Dismounting, her hand on the pearl handle of her father's revolver, she approached. He was an Apache, young but with an oldness in his pain-glazed eyes. A deep, ugly gash ran down his leg, caked with dirt and dried blood. The smell of infection was faint but unmistakable. He had been left for dead, likely by the scalp hunters whose posters sometimes appeared in the saloon, offering bounty for hostile vermin. His breath was a shallow rasp. He watched her, his dark eyes holding no plea, only a fierce, defiant acceptance of his end at every lesson. Every whispered fear about the savages of the dragoons screamed at her to remount and ride, to let the desert have its due. But in his stillness, in his silent endurance, she saw not a monster, but a fellow creature broken by the same harsh land. It was an impulse, a moment of pure, uncalculated humanity that broke through the shell of the businesswoman she was forcing herself to become. Without a word, she uncorked her canteen and trickled water onto his cracked lips. He did not move, only his eyes followed her. She then took the small skinning knife from her saddlebag, a fine, steel-bladed tool, and placed it on the rock beside him, along with the rest of her water and a strip of jerky. It was not enough to save him, but it was a chance, a choice, a gesture that said, "I will not be part of your ending." Their eyes met for a long, suspended moment. A silent transaction passed between them, understood in a language deeper than words. Then she had ridden away, her heart hammering, half expecting an arrow in her back. It never came. She never spoke of it to a soul. The memory became a secret locket she wore inside, its meaning fading and shifting over the years, sometimes feeling like foolishness, sometimes like her one truly moral act. Now, that secret felt like the only thing standing between her and Jedediah Crowe's cold-eyed promise. The signs began subtly. A small, deliberate pyramid of 3 black stones appeared by the main gatepost one morning. Izzy, on her daily inspection of the grounds, noticed it immediately. It was too orderly to be natural. She mentioned it offhand to Mateo. His reaction was not one of confusion, but of quiet recognition. He studied the stones, his weathered face impassive. "The desert has eyes, Signora," he said, his voice low. "Not all are unfriendly." A few days later, a single, pristine hawk feather was tied with a strip of sinew to a low-hanging branch of the juniper tree that shaded her courtyard. It twisted slowly in the dry breeze, a silent signal. Her hired guards, good with guns but blind to the desert's subtleties, paid it no mind. But Izzy saw it, and she knew he was out there, the man from the canyon. He was watching Dot, who was both a profound comfort and a source of deep, unnerving disquiet. She was being protected, but by a force she could not control, could not command, and could not even comprehend. Her world of ledgers, where every action had a predictable reaction and every debt was quantified, was being invaded by something ancient and mystical. The fear of Crowe's blunt violence was now joined by a dizzying awe of this silent, unseen guardian. One evening, as Jedediah and his men lounged with menacing idleness outside the saloon, their laughter carrying on the wind like the cawing of crows, Izzy stood on her balcony. She looked past the town, past the visible threats, and let her gaze sweep across the darkening expanse of the desert. She was searching for a shadow, a flicker of movement. She saw nothing but the vast, indifferent beauty of the land, yet she felt a presence, a whisper on the wind. A debt, incurred 7 years ago, was waiting in the wings, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than any threat from Crowe, that the coming storm would not be settled by bullets or money alone. It would be settled by the older, sharper laws of the canyon and the honor of a ghost. The silence in the manor had become a physical presence, thick and heavy as wet wool. Isadora Vance moved through the opulent rooms like a ghost haunting her own life. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall was a drumbeat counting down to an unknown hour of reckoning. Jedediah Crowe's note, its words burned into her mind, had transformed her gilded cage into a prison awaiting its executioner. Be gone by sundown tomorrow, or we'll take it from your cold, dead fingers. The bluntness of it was its own kind of power. There was no negotiation, no posturing. It was a simple statement of fact. Her wealth, her influence, the very force of her will, all of it was rendered meaningless against the stark reality of a bullet. She had spent the day in a flurry of futile activity. She had met with her 6 remaining guards, their faces grim. They were good men, loyal to her payroll, but they were not soldiers. They were men who kept the peace against drunken brawls and the occasional claim jumper, not a siege by seasoned killers. She had ordered the heavy oak shutters barred, the doors reinforced with crossbeams. It felt like stacking twigs against a coming hurricane. Mateo had stood by her side, his silence more eloquent than any speech. Finally, as the sun began its final bloody descent, he spoke. "Senora, there is a back trail to the old Spanish mission. You could be there by morning and leave all this?" Izzy's voice was sharper than she intended, frayed by fear. "Let them have it? This is my life's work, Mateo." "It is stone and wood," he replied softly, his eyes holding a deep, weary sorrow. "A life can be rebuilt. It cannot be reclaimed from the grave." His words struck the core of her. She looked around the study at the ledgers containing every transaction, the deed box holding the proof of her empire, the fine French wallpaper. It was all a magnificent fiction, a performance she had been staging for years. Without her there to command it, it was just stuff. The realization was terrifyingly liberating and utterly devastating. As true darkness fell, a new kind of silence descended, one punctuated by the nervous shuffling of her guards on the porch below and the lonely cry of a coyote in the distant hills. She stood on her balcony, the double-barreled shotgun she had taken from the rack cold and heavy in her hands. She was no marksman. The weapon was a final, desperate statement, a symbol of her refusal to go quietly. From her vantage point, she could see the warm, treacherous glow of the Lonesome Star Saloon. They were in there, she knew. Jedediah Crowe and his wolves, drinking their courage to a fever pitch. Sundown had come and gone. Their deadline had passed. The attack was not a matter of if, but when. The waiting was an exquisite torture. A profound and suffocating loneliness gripped her. She was utterly alone. The townsfolk would bar their doors and pray the storm passed over them. Her guards would fight, but they would fall. There was no cavalry coming, no righteous sheriff to save the day. There was only her, the looming shadows of the men who wanted her dead, and the vast, uncaring desert, her gaze, desperate, swept across the black expanse beyond the town, toward the jagged silhouette of the Dragon Mountains. The memory of the wounded Apache Kaya surfaced again, not as a gentle recollection, but as a last frayed thread of hope. The stones, the feather, they had been a promise. But where was he? Had it been merely an observation? Had her own desperation made her see a savior where there was only a phantom? The wind picked up, sighing through the juniper trees, and it sounded like a whisper of mockery. Her composure, the iron control she had worn like a suit of armor for a decade, finally cracked. A single, hot tear of pure, undiluted fear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. This was how it ended. Not in a boardroom, but in the dirt dot. In that moment of absolute despair, an impulse seized her. It was irrational, born of a superstitious dread that felt more real than the cold metal in her hands. She leaned over the balcony rail, her face turned toward the dark mountains, and she whispered into the night, her voice a raw, broken thing. "You are out there. I know you are. I see your signs, please." She didn't know what she was asking for. An army? A miracle? She was a woman of commerce and reason, reduced to praying to a ghost, to a memory of her own fleeting decency. "He is coming for me. They will kill me, please." The wind swallowed her words, leaving only a profound silence in their wake. Nothing answered. The desert was dark and empty and still. She felt a fool. She had placed her final desperate hope in a shadow. Shouldering the shotgun, she turned her back on the night, ready to face her fate alone. The final act was about to begin. The sound that shattered the tense silence of the night was not a gunshot, but the splintering crack of her main gate being kicked off its hinges. Isadora's heart slammed against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. She stood just inside her heavy oak door, the shotgun slick in her sweaty palms. Through a narrow gap in the shuttered window, she saw them 4 dark shapes fanning out across her moon-washed courtyard like wolves. Jedediah Crowe stood in the center, a Colt in each hand, his pale eyes scanning the manor's facade. "Vance." His voice cut through the night, flat and deadly. "Your time's up. Come on out and we'll make it quick." One of her guards, a young man named Eli, stepped from the shadows of the porch, his rifle raised. "That's far enough, Crowe. Get off the lady's property." Hodge, the brute, didn't even bother with words. He fired twice. The reports were deafening. Eli cried out, stumbling back and clutching his shoulder before collapsing against a post. The other guards opened fire from their positions, the courtyard erupting in the staccato roar of gunplay. Muzzle flashes lit the scene in throbbing, hellish bursts. Jedediah and his men took cover behind a water trough and a woodpile, returning fire with practiced calm. Izzy watched, paralyzed as another of her men fell, his body tumbling down the porch steps. They were being picked apart. This wasn't a fight. It was a systematic execution. Jedediah, sensing the shift, stood and began walking calmly toward her door, firing methodically at the remaining guards, his advance unhurried, inevitable. This was it. He was coming for her. She raised the shotgun, her finger trembling on the trigger, aiming for his shape through the gap in the shutters. Her vision tunneled. The world narrowed to the man, the gun, and the end of everything died just as Jedediah's boot touched the first step of her porch. A different sound sliced through the gunfire high, sharp and piercing. The cry of a red-tailed hawk. It was so out of place, so unnaturally timed, that for a split second, the shooting faltered. It was followed by a soft, sickening thwump. Hodge, who was crouched behind the woodpile, let out a guttural scream of shock and pain that was entirely different from the cry of a gunshot wound. He staggered into view, an arrow shaft protruding from the meat of his shoulder, its fletching stark and alien in the moonlight. He clawed at it, roaring in confusion and fury. Another arrow whistled out of the darkness, this one from a different angle. It passed so close to Jedediah's head that he flinched, the air stirring his hair. He spun around, his cold composure finally broken, his eyes scanning the blackness beyond the courtyard wall. Where is he? Every eye, friend and foe, turned toward the high bluffs that flank the manor. There, silhouetted against the star-dusted sky, stood a figure. He was tall and lean, his long hair loose in the night wind. He held a bow, the curve of it a promise of primal violence. He did not move, did not speak. He was a statue of vengeance, an embodiment of the desert's harsh justice. It was him. Chaos, true and utter, erupted. Jedediah's men, spooked and disoriented, fired wildly at the bluff, their bullets pocking harmlessly against the distant rocks. In that moment of fractured attention, Izzy's remaining guards found their nerve, laying down a furious covering fire. Izzy watched, breath caught in her throat as Kaya moved. He didn't stand and fight. He vanished from the bluff and reappeared moments later as a flitting shadow along the courtyard wall. He was a ghost, using the terrain as his weapon. He moved with a fluid, predatory grace, his arrows finding their marks with silent, terrifying efficiency. Another of Crowe's men, the wiry Finch, fell with a choked gasp. An arrow through his thigh. As the gunfight raged in the center of the courtyard, Kaya flowed through the periphery, a destabilizing force. He created openings, drew fire, and sowed panic. At one point, he passed directly by her shuttered window. His face was in profile for a fleeting second, illuminated by a muzzle flash older, harder than the memory she held, but the eyes were the same, proud, fierce. His gaze met hers through the gap in the wood. It was not a look of comfort or reassurance. It was a look of stark, grim purpose. A debt was being called in, and he was here to collect. The civilized world of warrants and deeds had dissolved. The conflict had been stripped down to its most ancient, brutal essence. And in that moment, Isadora Vance understood that her salvation would not come from the law, but from the older, sharper law of the canyon. The world had narrowed to a single brutal truth: survival. The moment Kaya's arrow found its mark, the script of the fight was torn up and rewritten in a language of blood and vengeance. The initial shock of his arrival gave way to a new, more terrifying rhythm. This was no longer a simple siege. It was a hunt, and Jedediah Crowe's men had suddenly found themselves as the prey. Kaya did not stand and trade fire. He was a phantom of the courtyard, a fluid shadow that used the chaos as his camouflage. As Izzy's guards, emboldened by the sudden shift, laid down a furious volley from the porch, Kaya moved along the flanks. He used the water trough, the woodpile, the skeletal frame of a new buggy as fleeting points of cover. His movements were not the straightforward advances of the cowboys. They were circular, unpredictable. He would fire a single arrow from one location, and by the time the cowboy spun to return fire, a second arrow would already be whistling in from 20 feet away. Izzy watched, mesmerized and horrified from the slit in the shutters. She saw him pause for a heartbeat, his eyes scanning the chaos. He wasn't just shooting. He was strategically dismantling their will. His next arrow didn't target a man, but the lantern hanging from the saloon's porch post across the street. It shattered, spraying kerosene that ignited in a sudden whoosh of flame. The new, flickering light threw long, dancing shadows, creating confusion and turning the cowboys into starkly lit targets for her guards. Jedediah Crowe, his face a mask of pure, incandescent rage, bellowed at his remaining men. "Forget the guards. Find that savage. Find him. But finding him was like trying to catch smoke. Preacher, the silent gunman, had managed to corner himself near the stable, using his superior marksmanship to keep the guards pinned. He never saw Kaya drop silently from the low-hanging roof of the tack room. There was no struggle, no cry. One moment Preacher was there, sighting down his rifle. The next, Kaya's arm was wrapped around his neck. A sharp, brutal jerk, and the man went limp, collapsing to the ground like a sack of grain. Kaya retrieved his arrow from the man's thigh and melted back into the shadows before the others even noticed Preacher was gone. It was this cold, efficient brutality that chilled Izzy to the bone. This was not a rescue born of chivalry. It was a settlement, a transaction of violence for a debt of life. Kaya fought with a singular, terrifying purpose that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with the honor-bound code that had drawn him here. He was not her knight. He was her balance. The tide had turned irrevocably. Hodge was bleeding heavily, his roars of pain now becoming weak groans. Finch was disarmed and writhing on the ground. Only Jedediah Crowe remained, a cornered animal. He fired his pistol blindly into the shadows, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Face me, you devil. Face me like a man." His answer was silence. Then, a flicker of movement from the roof of her porch. Kaya stood there, outlined against the firelit sky, his bow now slung over his shoulder. In his hand he held a long, wicked-looking knife, the very skinning knife she had given him 7 years ago. He dropped to the courtyard without a sound, landing in a crouch between Crowe and her door. He straightened up, his shirtless, muscular torso gleaming with sweat, his long hair framing a face of stone. He said nothing. He simply stood, waiting, the knife held low. The message was clear. The guns were done. This would be settled the oldest way. Crowe, his eyes wild, threw his empty pistol aside and drew a bowie knife from his belt. With a raw-throated scream of fury, he charged. Kaya didn't move until the last second, then sidestepped with the grace of a dancer, the bowie knife slicing empty air. He moved in close, his own blade a silver flicker in the night. Izzy couldn't watch. She turned her face away, pressing her forehead against the cold wood of the door, the sounds of the brutal, close-quarters struggle grunts, the scuffle of boots, a sharp, pained gasp filling her ears. It was over in seconds. She heard a heavy, final thud. Then, silence. When she forced herself to look again, Kaya was standing over Jedediah Crowe's still form. He wiped his blade clean on a fold of Crowe's shirt, his chest rising and falling steadily. He then turned, and for the first time, his eyes met hers directly through the parted shutters. There was no triumph there, no pity. Only a deep, ancient weariness and the grim satisfaction of a task completed. The debt, it seemed, was almost paid. The silence that fell over the courtyard was heavier and more profound than the gunfire that had preceded it. It was a silence of aftermath, thick with the scent of gunpowder, blood, and spent violence. The last of Jedediah Crowe's men were disarmed, their leader dead, their will broken. Isadora's remaining guards moved among them, their movements slow with shock and exhaustion, securing the prisoners with rough hands. The door to the manor creaked open. Isadora Vance stepped out, the shotgun hanging loosely, forgotten in her grip. The cool night air was a shock on her feverish skin. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, scanned the scene of carnage, the bodies, the dark stains on the dust, the splintered wood. But her gaze did not linger on the dead. It found the living. Kaya stood apart, near the shattered remains of the main gate, a solitary figure at the edge of the light cast by the burning saloon across the street. He was cleaning his knife with a handful of dry grass, his movements methodical, unhurried. The fierce intensity that had possessed him was gone, replaced by a stillness that was both formidable and deeply weary. The turquoise and silver of his jewelry caught the firelight, and the muscles of his bare back and shoulders rippled as he worked. A monument to a different world. She walked toward him, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. The gulf between them was more than the 20 paces of dusty ground. It was the chasm between her world of ledgers and his world of canyons, between the language of commerce and the language of the land. She stopped a respectful distance away, close enough to see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the old scars that mapped a life of hardship on his skin. He finished his task and slid her knife back into the sheath at his hip. Then he looked at her. His eyes were dark pools, impossible to read. There was no expectation in them, no demand for gratitude. There was only a deep, ancient patience. Words felt inadequate, foolish. How could she thank him for this? For the bloodshed? For the lives taken to preserve her own? The transaction felt too vast, too primal for the language she knew. Instead of speaking, she did what she had done in the canyon 7 years prior. She acted. Slowly, deliberately, she placed a hand over her own heart. She held his gaze, letting the gesture speak of her profound, trembling gratitude. Then she gestured toward him, an open-handed offering of acknowledgement. He watched her, his expression unchanging. For a long moment, she feared he would simply turn and vanish back into the night, leaving her with only the ghost of his presence and the weight of the debt. Then he moved. He did not speak, but he pointed a finger, stained with dirt and smoke, toward the dark, jagged silhouette of the Dragoon Mountains. His home. His world. He then brought his hand back to his own chest, his fingers touching the turquoise pendant that rested there. His eyes never left hers. Finally, he made a different gesture. He cupped his hand, palm up, as if holding something precious. He brought it to his lips, a pantomime of drinking. Then he pointed that same cupped hand directly at her. The meaning was as clear and as pure as desert spring water. The debt for the water is paid. A sob caught in Izzy's throat, not of sorrow, but of a profound emotional understanding that shook her to her core. This was not the beginning of a new story. It was the end of an old one. The single impulsive act of giving water to a dying man had rippled through the years. A stone tossed into the still pond of fate, and the wave had finally reached the shore, washing away the threat to her life. The ledger was balanced. The account was closed. He had not come for reward, or for glory, or for her. He had come for this, for the restoration of a balance that her people had long forgotten. He had saved her not because she was Isadora Vance, the wealthy mine owner, but because she was the woman who had offered a drink of water. In his eyes, that single act of humanity had been worth more than all the silver in her mountain. And now the scales were even. Kaya turned and walked away without another glance. He did not vanish in a dramatic puff of smoke, but simply strode through the broken gate, his form dissolving into the deep, pre-dawn shadows beyond the perimeter of her world. One moment he was a solid, breathing man, and the next he was a memory woven back into the fabric of the desert. The debt was paid. The connection was severed. Isadora stood rooted to the spot long after he was gone, the weight of the silent courtyard pressing in on her. The first hints of gray were bleeding into the eastern sky, casting a sickly pallor over the scene of the night's violence. Her guards began the grim work of clearing the aftermath, their voices hushed. They looked at her with a new kind of respect, but she barely saw them. She walked back into her manor, the opulent rooms feeling alien and garish. The crystal decanters, the gilt-framed paintings, the thick Persian rugs, it all seemed like the trappings of a stranger. She went to her study and stood before the large, detailed map of the territory pinned to the wall. It was a map of ownership, of claims and boundaries, of routes and resources. It was the map she had lived by for a decade. Now she saw its lies. It showed her land, but it did not show the ancient, invisible trails Kaya walked. It showed the Dragoon Mountains as a topographical feature, not as a homeland. It showed Prosperity Bluff as the center of everything, when in truth it was just a fleeting scab on a vast, living landscape. The gilded cage was gone. Its bars had been melted down in the fire of the attack and reforged into a key by Kaya's final gesture. She was free. But freedom, she realized, was not the absence of threat. It was the presence of understanding. In the days that followed, the town expected her to tighten her grip, to use the event as an excuse for greater control, to rebuild her walls higher. She did the opposite. She summoned Mateo and her lawyers. The documents she had them draw up were not about reclamation, but about release. She signed over the deed to the Silver Saddle Saloon to the bartender who had worked there for 20 years. She turned the general store over to its manager. Most significantly, she established a town trust, granting the citizens of Prosperity Bluff shared ownership and governance of the Vance Silver Mine. It was no longer hers. It was theirs. The news spread through the territory like a grass fire, a story more incredible than the gunfight itself. They called it the miracle at Prosperity Bluff, though none but Izzy and her guards knew the true nature of the angel that had descended upon them. She did not leave immediately. She stayed long enough to see the new council hold its first meeting, to witness the bewildered hope on the faces of people who were now, for the first time, masters of their own destiny. The weight of her empire was lifted from her shoulders, and in its place was a quiet, steady purpose. On the morning she departed, she rode a sturdy bay mare, carrying only a bedroll and a pack of essentials. She wore a simple, practical dress of brown wool, not unlike the one she had worn on her fateful ride 7 years before. Mateo stood by the gate, his eyes shining with a mixture of sadness and pride. "Where will you go, Signora?" he asked. Isadora Vance turned her horse not toward the established stagecoach route to the east, but toward the vast, open expanse of the south. "Toward the Dragoon Mountains. I have a new map to learn," she said, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in years. She did not ride to find him. That chapter was closed. She rode to understand the world he represented, a world not of ownership, but of connection. Not of conquest, but of balance. She was no longer the Queen of Prosperity Bluff. She was a student of the desert, a woman who had been saved not by a man, but by the enduring power of a single, kind act. Her story had not ended with the gunfight. It had begun anew. And as she rode into the shimmering haze, the desert, in its immense and silent wisdom, welcomed her home.